The first step is to download your pattern. Select your file according to your paper format and the size you wish to make. Print your pattern at 100% scale. There is a scale test included on the first page of your pattern to ensure you have printed correctly. Trim around the thin black border and use clear sticky tape to stick the pages together. There is a layout included in the instruction guide to help you lay out all the pages correctly. Trim around each individual pattern piece and lay the pattern onto the fabric. You can follow the cutting layout included in the instructions to make the most economical use of your fabric. Cut according to the individual instructions marked on each of the pieces. This pattern requires woven fusible interfacing for the collar and front and back facings. If your fabric is more on the heavyweight side, you may not wish to include it, but it is particularly recommended in the collar for a nice crisp finish. Place the front pieces on top of the back piece with the right sides touching one another. Match up along the shoulder seam and side seams. Pin together and stitch using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Overlock the shoulder seams and side seams. Fold the sleeve piece in half with the right sides touching one another. Match along the inner seam of the sleeve. Pin in place and stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Overlock the seam and then repeat for the other sleeve. Turn the hem of the sleeve upwards towards the wrong side by 6 mm or 1/4 inch and press well with the iron. Machine stitch the hem to secure it. Then repeat by turning the hem up a further 6 mm or 1/4 inch and top stitch to secure. The sleeve hem edge will now have a double turned, completely enclosed neat hem. Adjust your sewing machine to the longest stitch length. Stitch between the 2 notches marked by the wavy line at the top of the sleeve head on the pattern. Leave the tail ends of the thread long enough so that we can pull them to gather the sleeve head later. Pin the sleeve into the armhole on each side. Start at the underarm or the inner seam and pin upwards towards the top of the sleeve. Pin until you reach the uppermost notches where the gathering stitch has begun on both the front and the back. Pull on the threads to gather the top of the sleeve head so that it is small enough to fit into the top notches on the front and the back of the armhole. Once completely pinned in place, stitch the sleeve into the armhole using a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance and then overlock the seam. Repeat for both sides so that the sleeves are both now in place. Place the collar pieces on top of one another with the right sides touching. Stitch around the outer straight edge and the 2 short ends using a 6 mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just leave the curved edge that has the notches unstitched for now. Clip the corners and turn the collar through to the right side. Press sharply all the way around the edges with the iron. Pin the collar piece in place along the neck edge. Position the collar in between the notches on the front neckline. Take time to pin the collar in correctly, as it may not seem like it will fit in first due to the curves, but it will. Stitch together using a 6 mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Place the front facing pieces on top of the back facing piece with the right sides together. Pin along the shoulder seam and stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock around the outer edge of the facing. Turn the overlocking under to the wrong side and press it with the iron. Top stitch along the outer edge to secure it in place. Place the facing pieces on top of the main garment with the right sides touching one another. Pin along the vertical edge and along the top edge. Stitch along the outer edge using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You'll need to ensure that you also stitch along the short lowest edge of the front facing. You can see here when I'm stitching, I'm starting along the lowest short edge of the front facing, keeping my needle down, pivoting, and then going along the vertical edge along the center front. If you've done this all correctly, this is how the front facing will look at the hem. Overlock the main hem edge. Turn the facing out so that the garment is now the right way out. Press along the facing edge with the iron. Then turn the hem edge upwards by 1.2 cm or 1/2 inch and press well, and then pin in place and then top stitch with the sewing machine. Use the pattern to mark on the correct placement of the buttonholes appropriate for your size. Change your machine foot to the buttonhole foot and follow your machine's settings and instructions to create 3 buttonholes as per the pattern placement. The buttonhole should be stitched on the right hand side of the garment. Make sure you do a few test buttonholes on some scrap fabric to avoid any disappointment. Once the buttonholes have been created, use a seam ripper or snips to very gently cut open the buttonholes. Take a lot of time and care here. Use the pattern to mark the correct placement of the buttons, using a hand sewing needle to stitch the buttons in place. The button should be stitched on the left hand side of the garment. Once that's finished, you're all done.